Emotions. I have them, you have them, and fictional characters have them too. Well, in theory at least. See, in comics, many characters remain static, serving a function to the greater universe of storytelling that needs them to fit within certain familiar parameters. But while this frequently applies to the likes of Spider-Man and Wolverine, many secondary characters can hide their development in plain sight amongst the cast of a team series. For decades, this is the unique space that Hawkeye occupied within the Avengers franchise. However, after years as a fan-favorite character, his development was shunted at its peak. Just as things began looking up for Hawkeye, as he was reunited with his estranged wife Mockingbird and appointed as the leader of the new Avengers, he was cast aside in favor of old favorites, forced into a role he had long since outgrown. Now, the story of Hawkeye Mockingbird can be seen as an important chapter in the lives of these heroes, one that would lead to a new era that would change Marvel for years to come. Hey, before we get started, I just wanted to give you a heads up that at a few points in this video I talk about sexual assault. It is an important part of Hawkeye Mockingbird's history, and I felt that it would be inappropriate to leave that out, but I also wanted to make sure that you had that information before you got started. Thanks. Hawkeye, the Avenging Archer, first debuted in 1964 in Tales of Suspense number 57. Created by Marvel maestro Stan Lee and legendary artist Don Heck, orphan Clint Barton trained for years to be an archer. One day, he saw Iron Man in action and was inspired to become a mass vigilante, taking on the name Hawkeye. It took a lot of hard work, but eventually Clint earned himself a place on the Avengers, Earth's mightiest heroes. With the help of Captain America, Hawkeye grew into his role on the team and became a fan-favorite character, eventually earning himself a leadership position on the first Avengers expansion team, the West Coast Avengers. Elsewhere in the Marvel Universe, Bobby Morse began appearing as a supporting character in the pages of Astonishing Tales. Created by Len Wein and Neil Adams, she made sporadic appearances across various different Marvel books until 1980's Marvel Team-Up number 95, where she picked up the name of her more famous alter ego, Mockingbird. It wasn't long before the young biologist turned shield agent turned vigilante found herself in the crosshairs of Hawkeye. While the two were initially at odds, they soon realized that they shared a common foe and teamed up to take down the nefarious Crossfire. After winning the day, the two acted on their palpable sexual tension, fell in love, and quickly eloped. Soon after the pair's marriage began, Bobby joined the West Coast Avengers, and the team was flung across history by Kang the Conqueror, a time-traveling fiend. Stranded in the Old West, they encountered a gang of vigilantes, including the Phantom Rider, Lincoln Slade. Lincoln was immediately infatuated with Mockingbird, calling her his goddess. As the WCA were leaving the era via time platform, the Phantom Rider struck Mockingbird and abducted her. Clint and the rest of the team were sent to ancient Egypt, while Bobby was placed under the spell of a love potion made by Lincoln. She lost control of herself and was unaware of her marriage, her life, and even her own time period. Lincoln then forced himself onto Bobby and raped her in this delirious state. When she eventually shook off the effects of the potion, Mockingbird was stranded, alone, and furious at the Phantom Rider for what he had done to her. Mockingbird chased Lincoln down, fought him on the top of a cliff, and in the heat of the battle, threw him over the edge. The Phantom Rider managed to cling to a ledge and pleaded with Bobby for help, but she chose not to pull him up. Thus, as Lincoln's strength faded, he fell to his death. When she eventually reunited with the team, Mockingbird withheld the true story of these events from Clint, and as a result, a rift grew between the two from this unspoken tension. Later, the modern-day ancestor of the Phantom Rider told Hawkeye a version of what had happened, sending Clint into a fury for Mockingbird's role in Lincoln's death. In response, Bobby left the team and her marriage with Clint behind. And in my eyes, she was right to do so. Clint's anger was incredibly insensitive and egotistic of him, but it wasn't just Bobby who left, as Tigra and Moon Knight left too in solidarity with her. Regardless, Mockingbird eventually returned and reconciled with the WCA, and even Hawkeye. Unfortunately, their happiness would not last. During a battle with the satanic Mephisto, Bobby was killed in the line of duty, causing the West Coast Avengers to disband. With Mockingbird's passing, Clint's life quickly spiraled out of control. He went on a journey of self-discovery with a dog person named Rover. Yes, really. And later vanished alongside the rest of the Avengers in the Earth's battle against Onslaught. When the heroes returned, Hawkeye once again found himself on the Avengers, but left shortly after to lead the Thunderbolts, a team of reformed villains. It was during this time that Hawkeye began a relationship with Moonstone, a member of the Thunderbolts, though Clint still had a lot of baggage from Mockingbird's death. This came to a head when the Thunderbolts ventured to Hell to try and save Bobby's eternal soul from Mephisto. In the confusion of the moment, the team accidentally grabbed the soul of Hellcat, another former hero, and were left with no way to try again. Eventually, both his relationship with Moonstone and his time with the Thunderbolts came to their natural end, and Hawkeye returned to the Avengers. Unfortunately, his timing couldn't have been worse, as it wasn't long until the Earth's mightiest heroes faced their darkest day. In the cataclysmic story Avengers Disassembled, the Scarlet Witch lost control of her powers, causing a series of disasters and deaths that devastated the Avengers. One of these disasters brought an attacking armada of agitated alien antagonists in the form of the Kree, and during the ensuing battle to save New York City, Hawkeye's quiver caught fire. With no time to disrobe, Clint grabbed a nearby enemy soldier and flew into a Kree ship, destroying it and himself in the process. In a moment that mirrored the loss of Mockingbird, Hawkeye's death was the final straw for the Avengers, and they too disbanded. At the start of the new millennium, the Avengers were a fairly middling franchise. While Marvel had found success with their initial Heroes Return titles, sales had since dropped on Captain America, Iron Man, and Thor. And while Avengers was still doing fine, Marvel wanted to elevate the series to the height of its other premier superhero team, the X-Men. To do this, writer Brian Michael Bendis and artist David Finch were brought in to launch a new version of the franchise, aptly called New Avengers. But in order to do that, they had to end the old Avengers. The events of the aforementioned Avengers Disassembled storyline were the necessary evil that Marvel needed in order to reach new heights for Earth's mightiest heroes. As with most changes in comics, it was extremely controversial. Hawkeye's demise caused a huge rift in the fan community, as many readers found his death disgraceful and disrespectful. Some even thought that Bendis had a bias against Clint, but luckily, the writer had bigger plans for the hero in store. As this new direction started picking up steam, Marvel put Brian Michael Bendis in charge of House of M, a crossover storyline that saw the New Avengers and the X-Men confront the Scarlet Witch for her previous actions, and in the ensuing conflict, she rewrote reality. Twice. Amongst the many changes to the world that she made, the Scarlet Witch brought Clint back to life. Confused and struck with grief over what had happened, he traveled the world and searched for answers. At the same time, a young woman named Kate Bishop took on the mantle of Hawkeye. The Superhero Registration Act was passed, the Avengers were torn apart at the seams, Steve Rogers died, and eventually Clint was offered the role of Captain America. Instead of taking on his former mentor's mantle, Clint joined the now renegade team of New Avengers, who were running from the Registration Act, taking up the mantle of Ronin, a masterless samurai, to reflect the chaos and confusion in his life. And that is where things get spicy. From the beginning of his New Avengers run, Brian Michael Bendis had been quietly building up the threat of the Skrulls, an alien race of shapeshifters that had been plaguing different heroes for decades. In the blockbuster Secret Invasion event, it was revealed that the Skrulls had been secretly abducting and replacing people for years. Who was replaced and when in their history they were abducted became a very important part of the story and impacted many of the titles coming out of the event, such as Hank Pym's return in Mighty Avengers and Dum Dum Dugan in Secret Warriors. Amongst these choices was a curveball. As assistant manager of marketing communications, an aspiring writer, Jim McCann, suggested that they use this as an opportunity to bring Mockingbird back from the dead. Bendis and the writer's room loved it, and McCann was given the green light for a new miniseries that would explore Bobby's return and the effect it had on Clint. In March 2009, New Avengers: The Reunion hit store shelves. Joining McCann was David Lopez, a young artist coming off of a multi-year run on Catwoman at DC Comics. The series followed Clint and Bobby as they tried to pick up the pieces of their relationship, while also exploring what Mockingbird had endured during her years in Skrull captivity. It was a thrilling, character-driven series that was rewarding for longtime fans as well as new readers who were intrigued by Bobby's shocking return. After all, at this point Mockingbird had been gone for well over a decade, so for many people this was their first introduction to the character. Marvel saw how well it was doing and immediately drafted plans for a subsequent series from the creators. At the same time, Brian Michael Bendis incorporated Mockingbird into his ever-evolving New Avengers roster. Bobby dotingly stood by Clint's side as he was elected leader of the team. As Ronin, Clint fought for the memory of Steve Rogers, the world he felt was slipping through his fingers, and the wife he was so happy to have back. This conviction made him a worthy protagonist to take on the corrupt Norman Osborn, his military force Hammer, and the Dark Avengers. But when the conflict came to a head in the storyline Siege, a returning Steve Rogers became the key figure instead. In what should have been his finest hour, Clint was relegated to a side character as Norman Osborn fell from grace by Captain America's hand. The end of Siege brought with it the start of the Heroic Age and a brand new status quo for the Mr. and Mrs. Smith of the Marvel Universe. Clint took back the name Hawkeye and joined the Avengers, while Bobby stayed with the New Avengers, both of which were written by Bendis. At the same time, the new Hawkeye Mockingbird series by McCann and Lopez began. Debuting in June of 2010, it saw Mockingbird leading an entirely new WCA, this time in the form of the World Counterterrorism Agency. The first arc, titled Ghosts, also offered an interesting callback for old fans as the duo faced off against the return of Crossfire and a new iteration of the Phantom Rider. Unfortunately, the arc would prove to be the only one for the series, as it failed to pick up enough sales to continue. Trying to make the best out of the situation, Marvel salvaged the planned second and third arcs of the series by strategically turning them into miniseries. The second arc, a crossover with Black Widow, was repackaged as a book called Widowmaker. The story tied together the threads of Hawkeye's past with Black Widow, Mockingbird's actions in the WCA, and the shocking return of Ronin, making one cohesive whole that rewarded readers for their investments in the characters. However, the plans for the series' third arc were changed dramatically, removing Mockingbird from the equation for what was now called Hawkeye Blind Spot. Additionally, David Lopez was taken off the series, replaced with artist Paco Diaz. Now, Diaz did a great job, don't get me wrong, but intentionally or not, Marvel was slowly stripping away the elements that had made the original series so popular with fans. And thus, with the conclusion of Blind Spot, McCann's tenure with Hawkeye and Mockingbird ended with a whimper, as the writer handed off what dangling plot threads he could for Bendis to use in his Avengers work. The first issue of Hawkeye and Mockingbird sold roughly 27,500 copies in June 2010. It was the 73rd highest selling comic that month and 61st for overall revenue earned due to the inflated $3.99 price tag. Needless to say, that was not a strong debut. For the sake of comparison, New Avengers The Reunion sold nearly 47,000 units when it came out in March 2009. Unfortunately for Hawkeye and Mockingbird, this soft launch was not what Marvel was looking for. New books need strong sales to show the publisher that they're worth continuing, and retailers need strong sales to give them confidence to buy more of a book. This didn't offer anything for either group. Subsequent series Widowmaker and Hawkeye Blind Spot fared even worse, launching with 18,810 and 14,235 units respectively. So what does this tell us? Well, generally speaking, a superhero comic is sold on the name value of the character or on the reputation of the creative team. Either of these can be a critical marketing tool to use to help sell books. In the case of New Avengers The Reunion, the series masqueraded as an Avengers title and spun directly out of the best-selling Secret Invasion storyline, covering up for the young creative team. But since neither Clint nor Bobby was particularly important to Siege and it didn't have the name Avengers in the title, Hawkeye and Mockingbird lacked built-in marketing. Marvel attempted to balance this out with their thorough promotional plan, giving comic book shops multiple free books to hype up the series, as well as a feature in the Enter the Heroic Age one-shot, but it all got quickly lost in the shuffle of the line-wide initiative. The Heroic Age branding ushered in 8 new ongoing series, 8 limited series, and a sea of one-shots, all within 2 months. plus brand new storyline directions for books like X-Men Legacy and the Thunderbolts. Combine this with the regularly scheduled new books like Black Widow and the failed Astonishing line of titles, and the problem makes itself clear. In June 2010 alone, Marvel put out 24 issue number 1s. It was too much, and it led to many poor launches and an abrupt end for Hawkeye and Mockingbird, as well as other books like Atlas and Young Allies. And one last thing that I do think is worth mentioning is that Marvel was struggling to create financially sustainable books with female title characters during this time. Between the end of the Carol Danvers-led Miss Marvel title in February 2010 and the launch of her new role as Captain Marvel in July 2012, Marvel was only able to produce one successful ongoing series with a female title character, X-23. Countless other books like Spider-Girl, Black Widow, and even a new Ghost Rider were all cancelled within months of launching. It isn't that these books weren't good or well received, because many of them were great, honestly, they just didn't sell. For the sake of time, I can't dive into this phenomenon too much here, but if you're interested, let me know in the comment section and we can chat. When Clint Barton returned to life in the wake of House of M, Brian Michael Bendis aimed to transform the character. On the surface, this was represented by his change from Hawkeye to Ronin, but what made this change work so well and what helped win over fans was that this external change was a reflection of the inner conflict that he was enduring. Clint roamed the world and searched for meaning, literally becoming the wandering samurai that he derived his name from. And this wasn't random either, as all the ways that he had previously used to define himself were slowly stripped away by a changing world. Who was he without the Avengers? What value was there in overcoming his own crooked origins when the corrupt became the new ruling power? Without Steve Rogers around, who was there to tell him that he was making the right choices? It became a great foundation for unique character art that fans could sink their teeth into. One of the key storytelling techniques that enabled this to happen was methodical pacing of New Avengers. Even as the team was on the run from a cruel oppressor determined to ruin America with his tyrannical policies, Bendis found ways to pepper in key character interactions that helped not only inform the plot, but the emotions of the cast as they went through their journey. These could be an intimate conversation between lovers or a group meeting in the kitchen, but Bendis always found a way to use them to help inform the plot. McCann used a similar technique in New Avengers: The Reunion, using Clint and Bobby's relationship as the catalyst for the unfolding story. While they were facing off against the forces of AIM, the central conflict was always their past, and the tension associated with it. Through dialogue and reflection, a small-scale battle in Spain felt just as important as any world-ending chaos could. Additionally, McCann used this plot to play Bobby against a corrupted doppelganger of herself. In doing so, Mockingbird realized how much she needed Clint in her life, just as he came to realize the same in the regular New Avengers series. These complementary storytelling decisions built one cohesive whole and helped flesh out their relationship and their individual character arcs. Unfortunately, this firm understanding of the characters was thrown away in the build-up to Siege. Now, don't get me wrong, I love Siege. I think it's a very enjoyable end cap to Dark Reign and the work being done in the Avengers franchise at that time. But I also think that the central narrative suffers from having too many characters. Many books at this time were focusing on their individual heroes facing off against Norman Osborn, whether that be Steve Rogers in the pages of Captain America, Tony Stark in Invincible Iron Man, or Thor in, Thor. But Siege itself was only 4 issues long, so with limited space for the story to unfold, Bendis quickly mixed all of these elements together. In the end, Steve Rogers emerged as the de facto face of heroism against Osborn's tyranny, and as a direct consequence of this, Clint was emotionally cucked. The return of Steve Rogers coincided with the end of Clint Barton's emotional development. Though Clint's journey began as he walked the earth looking for answers after House of M, it was the death of his mentor that served as the emotional catalyst for Clint to become Ronin. With Cap gone, Clint finally became the hero he was always meant to be. Supported by Mockingbird, he became the leader of the New Avengers and a champion for all people, driven by a passion to fix the world. That's what made Norman Osborn such a worthy foe for him. Clint had lost everything he had earned, while Norman had the world handed to him. It was poetic. But when Steve returned, Clint's development stopped, and Marvel pressed the emotional reset button. Almost immediately, he became a wacky quipster again, and he lost much of the agency that readers had grown to love. Steve came back in Captain America Reborn, which was focused on Bucky and didn't have time to explore how Clint felt. At the same time in New Avengers, when Steve reappeared, Bendis was already building up to Siege, so there wasn't room for the slow character development that had been a staple of the series. And in Siege itself, well, Marvel wanted to sell comics, and the story of the familiar symbol of America coming back to punch an evil tyrant in the face was too good to pass up. So Clint just smiled when he saw Steve, or rejoiced when he swooped in for the victory lap, but that moment wasn't earned by Steve. It should have been Clint's. He was the one to put in the work and build up the momentum to topple Norman's regime. To put it bluntly, Clint got the shaft. In a different world, I would have been totally okay with this. Had Hawkeye Mockingbird continued, I don't even think this would have been an issue. In promotional interviews for the series, McCann talked about his plans for the future of the characters. McCann was going to explore Clint's decision to become Hawkeye again, and explain why he abandoned the Ronin mantle, which seemingly would have addressed this missing piece of Clint's character arc. In lieu of this, the only acknowledgement we had for the change was a joking exchange from the start of Bendis' Avengers title. The first arc of Hawkeye Mockingbird immediately focused on many of the issues surrounding Bobby's past, and also introduced an interesting new dynamic to the couple's relationship, as Hawkeye felt that he was losing himself to Bobby's work with the WCA. These identity issues were a great way to build off of what Clint had just endured, and that arc is easily my favorite of all of McCann's work on the characters. Unfortunately, since he was planning for a longer story and was still busy introducing new plot threads, McCann didn't immediately resolve the lingering questions from Clint's transition back to Hawkeye. There was a bigger story at play, but it was one we would never get to read. The transition from Dark Reign to the Heroic Age resulted in a complete turnaround in the life of Clint Barton. One day he was passionate, empowered, and leading the charge to save the world. And then without a mention, he was back to his old life in a bougie skyscraper with hardly a worry. Hawkeye and Mockingbird was set up to explore the lingering emotional effects of Clint's journey, but McCann was barely able to scratch the surface of this potential in his limited time with the series. Without their own book to anchor them, both Hawkeye and Mockingbird quickly went adrift in the midst of the ever-blossoming cast of Avengers and New Avengers. Bendis had told his story for Clint Barton, and it seemed like he never had much in store for Mockingbird, who was brought back at the behest of McCann to begin with. They just became bit players in the Marvel Universe at large, waiting for somebody else to pick them up again. Just as McCann's tenure on Hawkeye and Mockingbird's story ended, Clint was thrust onto the global stage with the release of the Marvel feature film, Thor. Played by Jeremy Renner, Hawkeye was a minor character being set up for big things with the forthcoming Avengers movie. With curious moviegoers looking to the comics for answers on who this new character was, Marvel began putting Hawkeye into more and more new releases, but kept him in an evergreen state so he would be accessible to the new readers. Hot on the heels of Hawkeye Blindspot, Marvel produced Ultimate Comics Hawkeye, which featured an alternate reality version of Clint, more in line with what the MCU would use. There was also Avengers Solo, a miniseries by Jen Van Meter that told an isolated story with Clint in regular continuity. In an interesting twist, Jim McCann actually wrote a backup feature for this series, but it focused on the Avengers Academy students and not on Hawkeye himself. As this ended, Clint appeared in Captain America and Hawkeye, the latest adventure in the Captain America team-up series. All the while, Bendis began wrapping up his now 8-year run on the Avengers franchise, leaving both Avengers and New Avengers in fall of 2012. And just as this wrapped up, something amazing happened. In August 2012, Marvel released a new Hawkeye series by writer Matt Fraction and artist David Aja. The series gained immediate critical adoration and proved to be one of the greatest success stories of the year. The book asked what does Hawkeye do on his day off, focusing on the not-so-mundane adventures of Clint Barton's day-to-day life. It was a revelation, and this simple formula was later replicated by many books, inspiring a wave of quirky stories for some of Marvel's secondary heroes. And for longtime fans, the book was a great follow-up to the work of Bendis, McCann, and more, as it forced Clint to address the problems that came as a result of him living such an endlessly adventurous lifestyle. Sure, it didn't address the fallout of Clint's time as Ronin, but it addressed his failed marriage, his destructive habits, and his inability to hold on to his personal growth. It literally turned the missed opportunities of previous iterations of the character into a critical flaw in his personality. Honestly, it was brilliant, and I think it's one of the most important comics that Marvel has ever put out. It is easily one of my all-time favorites. I cannot recommend it enough. In comics, it's common to see publishers reset a character to keep them accessible to the universe at large. It's easy to recognize this too when it happens to major players, but it's interesting to see how these decisions impact secondary characters. In the case of Hawkeye and Mockingbird, the duo was able to develop naturally for years, hidden in the pages of West Coast Avengers and later New Avengers. But when the spotlight was thrust upon them, the pair was sadly forced to retreat away from the light, back to their familiar roles in the shadows of the Marvel Universe. However, while Hawkeye and Mockingbird may have only enjoyed a brief moment in the sun, the creative team of Jim McCann and David Lopez took advantage of every issue, page, and panel, creating a book that stands to this day as a great character examination of both Clint Barton and Bobby Morse. If their goal was to create a love letter to the Mr. and Mrs. Smith of the Marvel Universe, I'd say they were right on target. So that's it. Thank you so much for watching this video. Hopefully you got some joy and enjoyment out of it. And if you did, press the like button and comment about who your favorite Avenger is, or maybe things you'd like to see me talk about in the future. And of course, if you want to know what I'm talking about in the future, you have to be subscribed to the channel. So do yourself a favor, subscribe to the channel so you stay up to date with whatever videos I put out into the world. You can also follow me across social media at A White Cuban, where I will pretend to be interesting for your enjoyment, and it's absolutely free. And what else in life is free? Not much. Thanks. I love you, Clint. I love you, Bobby.